Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to do a first impressions video of the Lenovo Legion Go. Now this is a new handheld PC that just came out, very exciting. Now it was actually kind of an adventure getting one. Lenovo was going to send me out a review unit, but unfortunately something happened in the mail and it got returned to them. It had to do with like the battery and shipping it to Hawaii. Either way, I never actually saw that one, but I happen to have a pre-order from the one from Best Buy, and so that one arrived 2 days ago. That's what we're going to review here today. Now I'm going to break this up into two different videos. The first one is going to be the impressions here. I'm going to focus on things like the controls, ergonomics, like the audio and screen, as well as the size and weight. We're going to see whether or not this is a device worth picking up and playing, and if there are any sort of deal breaks from a hardware perspective. Now for the second video, I'll focus on some of the things that take more time to percolate: battery life, software issues, and performance, and I'll also do an in-depth comparison against the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally in case you're trying to decide between those three. Either way, this video will give you kind of most of what you probably need to know. For me personally, 75% about a device really has to do with the ergonomics and the screen and stuff like that, so we're going to be covering that in this video here. The other stuff, like the actual judgment of whether or not it's going to be a good fit for you, that's going to take a little bit of time. But I'll start working on it as soon as this video is done, and so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's get started with the specs. Number one, in terms of CPU, we have the Ryzen Z1 Extreme. That's the exact same chip you can find in the ROG Ally. And as I'm making this video, it's the most powerful integrated graphics CPU that you can find in a handheld today. We also have 16 gigabytes of LPDDR5X RAM, and it's clocked at 7500 MHz. And this speed will make a difference when it comes to using integrated graphics like on this handheld. Now we have two different storage options, either 512 gigabytes or 1 terabyte, and it is nice to see that they're using a full-size 2242 M.2 drive. Another big upgrade on the Legion Go is the display. This is 8.8 inches with a 1600p resolution. In addition, this is the first handheld that I've seen that has a 144Hz refresh rate. But as a caveat here, there are two drawbacks with this panel. Number one, this is a native portrait display. That means it may cause some issues when trying to play older Windows games. And even though we have a 144Hz panel, it's not a variable refresh rate and it doesn't support FreeSync. And that's a bit of a bummer because it would have smoothed out your gameplay experience as your refresh rate is kind of going up and down depending on the game you're playing. Now, because we have a bigger device, we also have a bigger battery. This is 49.2 watt hours, and that's a little over 20% larger than what you would find on the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally. In addition, this device has detachable controllers, and each of those have a 900 mAh battery inside. I'm not really sure what your battery life's going to be on that, but just judging from the milliamp hours here, I would expect something between 15 and 20 hours of battery life. Regardless, your console itself is going to die way before your batteries on the controller do. Now, according to their spec sheet, this device weighs 854 grams total, and if you take the controllers off, the base will be 640. And we'll do some weight testing later in the video. Now for connectivity, we have Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.2, and it also has two USB ports that are both capable of DisplayPort 1.4 out. Now this is a Windows-based device and it's running Windows 11 Home. And a couple other things worth noting: the two ports that I just mentioned are USB 4, and the Legion Go also has a microSD card slot to expand your storage. Now in terms of pricing, we have two different options. We have a $699 option with 512 gigs of internal storage, and this is the one I picked up because I plan on upgrading the storage myself sometime down the line. However, if you'd like, for an additional $50, you can get a 1 terabyte drive instead. And honestly, I think that 1 terabyte is a fair amount of storage for most use cases. So if I had to give a recommendation between the two, I think the $750 model is a better deal. Now inside the box, there's another box, and inside that box is a power supply. And this has a USB-C connection and is rated for 65 watts. Now one nice perk about the Legion Go is that it does come with its own hard shell carrying case. This reminds me a lot of the one that you can get with the Steam Deck, although with obvious Legion branding. Although one extra feature they have is a pass-through port if you want to charge the device while inside of its case. Now given the fact that Windows machines will often mysteriously turn themselves on when you plug them into power, I'm not sure how often I would actually use this, because I would be worried about it turning on and getting really hot inside. The case also comes with a little strap if you want to carry it that way, and the zippers themselves are branded Lenovo Legion. I think that's a nice touch. Now first thing I noticed when opening it up is that the case is super padded on the top side. In fact, it feels a little bit more padded than it actually needs to be, but I do appreciate the fact that it makes it very shockproof. Now underneath we have a little strap that'll help you remove the device from the case, and below that we have this little hockey puck thing. And this is supposed to be used for what they call the FPS mode. And the idea here is that when you're using that mode, you want to take off the right thumbstick by pulling it out. And inside the case, there's another small little hole, and that's where you're supposed to put that joystick cap. Now, another thing I noticed is that the Lenovo Legion Go fits perfectly inside of the Steam Deck sling bag from TomTalk. And this is actually the newer version of the bag that just recently came out. And one of the nice things about it is that it's made for some of these larger handhelds. It actually has a hard shell liner in the center of it. So what you would do is you put the Lenovo Legion Go underneath that hard shell, and that'll protect the device as well as those thumbsticks once you strap it in. And to be honest, the size of this bag is not that much larger than the Lenovo case that comes with the device, but of course this will have more space for things like a charging cable or maybe a bag of potato chips. Either way, this might make a nice little upgrade for your Legion Go, and I'll leave a link down below in case you're interested. And finally, let's take a look at the device itself. Now I've got a couple first impressions. The first one here is I was really impressed by the size of the screen. Now the next thing I noticed as soon as I picked up the device were the hard shell bumps on the back of the grips. These remind me of the bumps you would find on an Xbox controller, and I do appreciate that grippy texture. Next, when picking up the device, it did feel like the controllers were a little bit light and cheap feeling. You can definitely tell that all of the weight is centered into the base console itself, and I don't really like that feeling. It feels a little bit unbalanced. And finally, my last quick impression of the device were that there was just so many buttons around these controllers. And of course, we'll go over each of these as we get through, but man, I've got a lot of things to say about this whole experience. Before we get to that, let's talk about the controls themselves, starting with the analog sticks. Now these are actually a pretty big size for a handheld PC. I wouldn't say they're quite the size of a console's analog sticks, but they are very close. The thumbsticks themselves feel like they have a wide range to them. And I like the fact that the caps on these are so big. They're a little bit concave and also a little bit flat feeling, but overall I do like the larger size of them, and they feel pretty good around the thumb. When it comes to actually playing games, I didn't do a ton of testing here, but it did feel very natural to me. When playing something that's very analog centric where precision controls are important, like Super Mario 64, yeah, I feel like I have a full range of control right here and everything feels nice and smooth. Next, let's talk about the D-pad. Now this has a micro switch kind of feel to it. So it does have a very clicky D-pad to it. It kind of reminds me of an Xbox One controller. If I had to describe it, I would say that it kind of feels like 4 separate mouse clicks on the cardinal points. In addition, the travel here is super shallow and there is no pivot whatsoever. And it does feel fairly precise, especially when playing like modern games, but with retro games it's a different story. We'll start with the contra test. This is where I press down on the D-pad and then try to rock it back and forth. And what we don't want here is our character to move all over the place, because that means you'll get accidental diagonals. But you do want to have a little bit of wiggle room there where the character will move just a little bit left and right. However, as you can see here, there is barely any movement whatsoever. And this is great in the sense that you're probably not going to get any accidental diagonals when playing any sort of game on this device, but it does mean that hitting diagonals are going to take a little bit more force. When actually playing Contra and trying to hit a diagonal, I was able to do that, but it definitely took a lot of deliberate force to actually hit those diagonals. Meanwhile, if we try to play a game that heavily relies on diagonals like Super Street Fighter 2, I found that for this one, when trying to do either a Hadouken or a Shoryuken, it was pretty hard. Overall, I would say the Hadoukens were easier. I probably had about a 60% success rate, but when it came to Dragon Punches or Shoryukens, yeah, it was much harder, maybe about a 10% success rate. Now, it may be that I just need time to adapt to this D-pad, but I've been playing Street Fighter games for about 30 years at this point with various D-pads, and this is probably one of the worst that I've played with these type of games. Now this is one very specific use case. If you're going to play maybe a modern Street Fighter game, it's a little bit more forgiving, so this may not be as much of an issue. And for other games, it won't be an issue at all. Let's take Super Mario World as an example. This one mostly focuses on the 4 cardinal points, and in that regard, you'll have absolutely no issue hitting those buttons when you need to. I will say that the lack of travel here does make it feel just a little bit off. It doesn't feel very retro, but from a control standpoint, I have no issues when it comes to a retro platformer. Now, when trying to play a more precision-based modern platformer, it might be a little bit different. For example, with Celeste, again, I had to be pretty deliberate about actually hitting those diagonals, but with this game in particular, I didn't really have any issues actually hitting them when I wanted to. So if anything, I would say that this is a decent D-pad, and I really do think this handheld PC was designed with more modern games in mind, and those are going to work just fine. However, if you want this to also double as a retro gaming machine, then the D-pad itself is just a little bit less than ideal. Also on the left side, we have our start and select buttons. This is kind of weird that they're down here instead of on the top left and right. And to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of this design here either. I don't like that they're spaced so far apart, and it just kind of looks like they're lazily positioned. Next, let's talk about these shoulder and trigger buttons. Now, these shoulder buttons are much larger than I was expecting. I don't think they're the biggest I've ever seen on a handheld, but they are definitely up there. but they are fairly light to the touch, so you can press them down pretty easily, and you can basically hit them from any angle you'd like. On a similar note, the trigger buttons are quite large, but one thing I do like about them is that they don't have a ton of travel to them. It's just about right, not too shallow, not too wide, so I think it's going to work well in a wide variety of use cases. And I think that if your hands are larger than mine, which are medium sized, then you'll probably really enjoy the feeling here. In fact, I kind of felt a few times that they were almost a little bit too large for my hands. Now, that never got in the way of my gameplay, but all the same, I did want to make a note of that these are pretty large triggers. Also on the back of the left side, we have two different function buttons. By default, these don't actually do anything, but when you detach them and use the FPS mode, they will. By the way, to detach a controller, you're going to press on this very bottom button and then slide it down. If you're used to using a Nintendo Switch, it's going to be a little bit unintuitive, but you'll get used to it. And yeah, like I mentioned before, these Joy-Cons feel unnaturally light and a little bit cheap in that regard. Anyway, putting them back is pretty easy. You just put it in the reverse way. Another thing I noticed when putting them back is that they don't slide as much as you might think. In fact, it's more like a quick little thunk to actually install it. Again, I think it's something that you'll probably just have to get used to. Now, one thing that concerned me about having detachable controllers is the amount of wobble or wiggle when you have them connected. And I will say that you can definitely feel that there's a little bit of wiggle there, but you do have to twist it quite a bit to actually feel that. If anything, I would say they're actually more sturdy than not. And it's kind of hard to convey that in video, especially because I can't really hold this thing still when I'm moving it back and forth. But yes, there is a little bit of wiggle when you move it, but not that much. When you're playing the device, you can definitely tell that you're using detachable controllers, but for me, it never got to the point where I felt like I was losing its structural integrity. If anything, I would say that the Nintendo Switch is definitely much worse in that regard. This one, for me, actively feels wobbly when I'm playing it in handheld mode. And so really, when it comes to the design here, I'm not sure they could have done it better. Yes, there's a little bit of wiggle here, but it's nothing that's deal-breaking for me. Next, let's talk about the face buttons, and really I don't have a lot of notes here. The buttons themselves are glossy and a little bit flat, and they are using a rubber membrane connection, so it's going to feel a lot like any other classic controller. I think the travel here is just about perfect, the size of the buttons is good as well, so I have zero complaints about these face buttons. They are very good. Next, we'll take a look at the trackpad that's below the right analog stick. And the trackpad feels pretty smooth. It has the same texture as the plastic on the device itself, which does feel smooth but a little bit smudgy. Now, I don't think this trackpad is meant to be used when actually playing games just because of the position. Instead, I think it's meant to aid you when it comes to Windows navigation. And it does work well in that regard, to the point where I didn't feel like I needed to plug in a mouse when actually navigating through and setting this device up. The trackpad itself will not click down when you press on it, so you have to tap on it to actually do a click. And if you want to do a right click, all you do is just click and hold for a couple seconds and the right click menu will pop up. But yes, when it comes to Windows navigation, it is very functional, and one of the nice perks is that in the quick menu, you can turn it off if you'd like so that you don't accidentally press it. Okay, next we've got a lot to discuss about this right Joy-Con. Number one, on the sides of it, you can see there are M1 and M2 buttons. These are essentially mouse buttons, but they won't be in use when you're in handheld mode. Similarly, on the back, we have an M3 and Y3 button that are horizontally placed, and as far as I can tell in handheld mode, these are also turned off by default. Really, the magic starts when you look at the bottom here and you turn it from off to FPS mode. This is where you're supposed to combine it with that hockey puck thing that comes in your case. And by the way, this is magnetically connected, so you can just kind of put it next to it and it'll know exactly where to connect it. And when I first tried to get my head and hand wrapped around this entire experience, I kind of had it backwards. I thought you're supposed to grip it ergonomically like you would in handheld mode, but in actuality it's the other way around. You're supposed to hold it unergonomically. The idea here is when playing in tabletop mode, you're supposed to kind of hold this like the handle of a gun. And those two M1 and M2 buttons are like your left and right mouse clicks. So it took me a while to kind of figure out how this works, so let me give you a quick walkthrough. So imagine you're at a crowded bar, surrounded by all your favorite friends, and they're all asking you to play your favorite handheld game in a tabletop mode. And this is your time to shine. So you open up your Lenovo Legion Go, and you're going to pull out your super cool looking hockey puck from the case, and then you're going to detach the controllers and try not to look like an idiot while you're doing it. And then you'll pull out the kickstand on the back, and by then people are going to be like, wow, is that like a grown-up Switch? And you're going to be like, yeah man, it totally is. Then you're going to pull out the cap from that right stick and put it lovingly inside your case, and then you're going to flip on the all-powerful FPS mode. From there, you'll attach it to the hockey puck, and you are ready to rock. And so what you'll do at this point is you'll move around that hockey puck like a mouse cursor, And then your left analog stick will be mapped to the cursor buttons or WASD depending on the game you're playing. And I gotta admit, when I saw all these promo videos, I thought this was a pretty cool concept. However, I found that the reality of holding this right analog stick is more confusing than not. To start, I have seen people actually just cupping this without taking off the right analog stick, but I really don't like the fact that it's pushing against my palm, so I have been taking it out. And like I mentioned, you're kind of supposed to hold it like the handle of a gun. And then you'll focus on the M1 and M2 buttons. In most first-person shooter games, that will be looking down the sights and then also firing. And then I also found that for most of the games I was playing, including like Destiny 2, these inner buttons were my melee. And I have to say this button setup right here was really unintuitive for me. And I often found that when squeezing the M1 and M2 button, I would also inadvertently press that melee button with the meat of my palm. And depending on the game that you're playing, this could have a disastrous result. For example, with Destiny 2, I could be in the middle of trying to aim down the sights and then firing, and then all of a sudden I would melee. And that'll take you completely out of the moment as you're playing. And of course, this is all subjective based on the game that you're playing and the configuration that's set up for that game. However, even then, after a few hours of use, just gripping this thing did feel pretty unintuitive. And we haven't even gotten to all the buttons. Let's talk about that trigger button, which now by default you're supposed to use with your thumb, which again just kind of feels unnatural. And for most first-person shooter games, this will be mapped to your reload button. And I did find that it was kind of an unintuitive stretch to try to press that button as well. Now there are 3 different FPS modes within the software, so you can adjust them there. But I also found that just going in and adjusting it myself in the in-game settings probably worked the best. So what I ended up doing instead is moving a lot of these functions over into the left Joy-Con. So now aiming down the sights is the left trigger, much like how it is in handheld mode. And then I can also use left bumper to do my reload, and that made a lot more sense for me. Also, the buttons on the back of the left controller were a lot more easier to press, and these actually made intuitive sense when it came to configuration. For most games, by default, the top button is going to be your jump button, and then the bottom one will be the crouch. And for me, that makes a lot of intuitive sense, so I kept it that way as well. So when it came down to it, after a few hours of testing, this is the setup that I settled on when it came to FPS mode. I would use my left analog stick to move my character around, I would use the left trigger to aim down the sights, and then the left bumper to reload when needed. On the right side, I basically turned off everything except for the M1 and M2 buttons. M1 for me was my fire button, and then the M2 button was the use button. And so this is one of those things that did take quite a few hours to actually get accustomed to, and I think that I still need more time as well. So I will revisit this when we get to the final review in about a week, but I will say that I was kind of underwhelmed by this control scheme overall. It really felt like there were just too many buttons to contend with, and they were placed in awkward positions. And I'm not even accounting for all of the buttons on this controller. For example, there's a full scroll wheel as well, and I forgot this was there 90% of the time. So I guess when it comes down to it, I do see that Lenovo is trying to do something new with this FPS mode, but the reality of using it for me was very unintuitive. And I can understand why Lenovo was really put in a tight spot by trying to innovate in this regard. After all, this controller is supposed to do many things. You're supposed to use it in handheld mode, and then it's also supposed to do this FPS thing as well. But I do think this is one of those cases where they tried to do too many things at once, and as a result, neither are going to be perfect. For example, I think that mouse and keyboard enthusiasts will probably have a better time than me when it comes to playing like this, but at the same time, it'll probably feel like a compromised experience just based on the positioning of the buttons. In addition, for me as a console gamer, I was kind of hoping for this to be my entry point into mouse and keyboard gaming. But the reality is, it's such an awkward setup that it kind of turns me off from trying it even more. And then of course the flip side of that is that having all of these additional buttons and functionalities can also get in the way of your handheld gaming experience. Now I think on the left side it's just fine. It's very similar to what it's like on a Steam Deck controller, in the fact that you have these 2 back buttons that you can map to other functions, but you can also just ignore them if you'd rather not use them. Meanwhile, all of the buttons on the right side are very hard to ignore. When playing in handheld mode, you're going to press that M1 and M2 button all the time, even if they're not actually doing anything. And for me, it did feel like an awkward experience. In addition, these 2 back buttons are in a weird place when you're playing in handheld mode as well. Along the same lines as the M1 and M2 buttons, I found myself pressing these accidentally all the time too. And so I often found myself just wishing that these buttons didn't exist at all. So really for me, the jury is still out with this control scheme. I do want to keep testing it for the next week, but I will say that for me, as someone who's very used to playing first-person shooter games with a controller, I definitely preferred it this way in handheld mode over that FPS mode. Okay, let's keep going. I haven't even finished my walkthrough of the device itself. Let's talk about the I/O on the top. So we have our volume button on the left and right, and then we have our USB 4 connection and our micro SD card slot. And thankfully, this is far away from the exhaust vent, so I don't think it's going to overheat, at least not like with the ROG Ally. After that, we have our headphone jack and sleep and power button. Also of note, these holes up top are actually our audio speakers. And this is the first time I've seen a top-firing audio handheld. And of course, we'll do some audio testing here later. Now, not a lot going on the bottom. We just have our USB 4 port here on the right. And so now let's take a look at the back. Number one, you can see we have a dual fan setup, much like with the ROG Ally. And then other than that, we have a very large kickstand that reminds me of the Nintendo Switch OLED edition. This kickstand is very stiff and firm, which is a good thing when it comes to a kickstand. And I was happy to see that it folds out to quite a wide angle. When playing in handheld mode, I actually like to set it on a table sometimes at a wide angle, and this is actually perfect for me. And if you want to hold it at a more narrow angle, it'll do that and it'll stay locked in place. Next, let's talk a little bit about ergonomics. Now, number one, when you're actually gripping the device, you will find that it is made for very large hands. In fact, I kind of felt like a kid when holding this device. There was just so much space for my hands on the back. It also has a very rounded feel with some pretty chunky grips, so it is very comfortable. However, one thing I found less than comfortable is the front part. This one kind of drops off at a sharper angle, and you will definitely feel that when you're playing. In fact, it gives it a very flat experience, way more so than the Steam Deck and even the ROG Ally. And the Ally itself is actually a pretty flat device as well. And I think you'll notice this flatness the most when it comes to these bottom corners. This is kind of the pressure point right here. You'll feel it digging into the palm of your hands. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to say this was actively uncomfortable, but it was something I observed as I was doing my game testing. But I do think that for a wide variety of use cases, for example, analog-centric gaming, as well as something a little bit more D-pad-centric, they both felt fine. It is a bit of a flat experience and something that I did have to get used to, but overall I would say it is an ergonomic controller, but not quite as comfortable as others on the market, like this Steam Deck or the ROG Ally. Speaking of which, let's move into size and weight comparisons with some others on the market. We'll start with the ROG Ally. This has the exact same chipset, but as you can see, there is quite a big difference in size. Not only does the 8.8-inch screen on the Lenovo Legion Go look a lot bigger than the 7-inch screen on the Ally, but the Lenovo also has a 16:10 aspect ratio, which means it's going to be taller as well. Now, the Steam Deck also has a 16:10 aspect ratio with a 7-inch screen size, and it is a little bit smaller than the Legion Go, as you can see. But in terms of dimensions, the size is not that much smaller than the Legion Go. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the Steam Deck has large bezels and the Legion Go doesn't, and then also the controllers on the sides of the Steam Deck screen are wider proportionally. Let's compare against a couple other larger handheld PCs. This is the AOK Zoe A1 Pro. This one has an 8-inch screen and 16:10 aspect ratio. And then we also have the Neo Kun. This is an 8.4-inch screen with a 16:10 aspect ratio as well. And this one's actually a little bit larger than the Legion Go and heavier too. So let's talk about weight. My unit is 862 grams, and it's 1 pound 14 ounces, so just under 2 pounds. And this makes it quite a bit more heavy than other handhelds like the ROG Ally and the Steam Deck. But like I mentioned, it is lighter than the Neo device. Now, when it came to actually holding the device and holding it under that weight, I didn't have any issues playing it at elbow height, but it's definitely not something I would want to play at a higher angle like shoulder height. Also, because we have a larger screen, I could comfortably lay it on my lap and see everything just fine on that 8.8 inches. But I found that I didn't like playing it at this angle just because it kind of had to crane my neck down a little bit too much. So if anything, I think the perfect positions are at this elbow height kind of level, or if you don't want to hold up the weight, I think it's a really comfortable handheld to play on a table as well. Next, let's talk about the screen. First thing of note, on the right side, there's a little sensor right here. This is going to pick up the ambient light and adjust the screen brightness accordingly. Now let's do a comparison between the overall brightness and dimness between the screens on the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally. Number one, the Legion Go has a peak brightness of 500 nits, and you can definitely see that when you turn it to the max because it does get quite bright. Another thing you'll probably notice is that the screen is nice and saturated and very color accurate. For example, it makes the Steam Deck color balance look quite a bit off, like more skewed to yellow or orange than it needs to. Now when it comes to max dimness, it does feel like the Steam Deck is getting dimmer, but it is still quite dim. It's about the same as the ROG Ally. So I do think you can play all three of these devices in dimly lit conditions and it'll be just fine. Now in terms of max brightness, it is also very similar here, although I would maybe say that the ROG Ally is just a tad brighter than the other. But again, here we can see that the saturation and color balance of the Legion Go just pops a little bit more than the ROG Ally. And I think that the ROG Ally is an excellent screen, one of the best out there. But in a head-to-head comparison between the two, I think the Legion Go looks better. So when it comes down to it, in terms of brightness and saturation and just how everything pops, I really do like the Legion Go. I think it's more vibrant and saturated than the ROG Ally, and I just love having a big screen like this as well. And I think it's no contest when compared to the Steam Deck. This one has double the resolution, 144Hz refresh rate, and the saturation and brightness are a lot better as well. Now there is one thing that I didn't like about the screen on the Legion Go, and that is how reflective it is. This is kind of common with some of these handhelds with larger displays, and as you can see here, it kind of shines like a mirror in a brightly lit room. By comparison, the ROG Ally has an anti-glare screen that looks a lot better in the same environment, and I also have the etched glass version of the Steam Deck, which also will mute some of those reflections as well. So I do think that the screen is better than the other two in all respects, except for this one little thing where it's more reflective. And this might be a big deal for you depending on whether or not you find this important. Next, let's do an audio test between these three at max volume. Okay, so between the three, I do think the Steam Deck is probably the loudest, and although the ROG Ally did sound very quiet in this test right here, in reality when playing with it in handheld mode, I've had no volume issues whatsoever. Now the speakers on the Legion Go do get quite loud, but you also have to bear in mind that they are up firing, which means that depending on the angle that you're holding them, you'll have to turn them up more than the others. I also found that the quality of the audio was a little bit more muted compared to the crisp, clear audio that we get when we have front-firing speakers of high quality on both the ROG Ally and the Steam Deck. So between the three, I do think that the Legion Go is probably the one falling behind the most. While we're also on the subject of audio, let's do a fan noise test. This is at 100% speed. I'd say this is pretty similar to the Steam Deck in terms of overall volume, but I am hearing a bit of coil whine as well. This is not a pleasant sound to my ears. However, bear in mind this was at 100% fan speed, and in actual practical use, I never really got to that point. I'm going to do a lot more performance testing in my final review, but at least in my initial indication, I found that between 15 and 20 watts seems to be the sweet spot with this device, and the amount of fan noise that you get there is really negligible. In fact, it's quite quiet altogether. So even though the fan noise at 100% is a little bit annoying, it's not something that actually had any real-world implications for me when I was playing games. Okay, last subject here is going to be a quick setup and software experience overview. And when setting it up, it's going to be very similar to getting any sort of new Windows PC. Now, once you're actually in the main menu, you're going to want to press on the Legion space button here on the bottom right. And then, of course, because this is a Windows machine, you should get ready for about 20 minutes of installs and updates altogether. I'm just going to speed through it, but as you can imagine, you're going to just tap on the yes button a lot of times. And you might also get a controller firmware update as well, so nice bonus there. Anyway, now that we're set up, let's actually talk about the software experience. On the top left, we have our Lenovo button. If you press that, it's going to bring up the Legion Space app. But I imagine the majority of your time you'll probably be in the library section. Here it's going to parse through all of your installed games from the various platforms and then put them all in one place. But given the fact that this is the first week this device has been out, a lot of this software is not quite up to speed. For example, the library picked up on my installed Steam games, but not the games that I actually had installed on my SD card. So right here I'm seeing about 33 games altogether between Game Pass and Steam. But if you look at my Steam library, I actually have about 75 games installed. And that's because over half of them are installed on my 1TB SD card. And so unfortunately I couldn't launch any of those games from the Legion Space app. Instead, I had to go directly into Steam and then find them here and then launch them. Now also within the Legion Space app, we have our settings. And there are quite a few things you can do here. For example, you can go in and change your performance mode, and you can also adjust your display parameters. For example, in terms of resolution, we have 1600p, 1200p, and 800p to choose from. And you can also adjust your refresh rate from 144Hz down to 60. But one thing of note, you can only do this when plugged into a power supply. And that's not the same case with the ROG Ally or the Steam Deck. Also within here, you can make some adjustments to the controller, for example, adjusting the rumble amount. And you can also make configurations to the lighting effects around the analog sticks. For example, I'm using what they call Lighting Effect 3. This is going to cycle through all of the different colors of the rainbow. And the nice thing here is you can also adjust the brightness and the speed of the rotation. So those are some nice little perks if you want to mess around with the LEDs. Next, let's talk a little bit more about those hotkeys on the top left and right. Like I mentioned, the left one will bring up the Legion Space app, and you can just press it again to make it go away. Now the right button is a little bit weird. If you press it once, it'll bring up a quick menu for Legion Space. And honestly, these menu items make no sense to me considering the fact that we have a dedicated Legion Space button anyway. And so I ended up finding myself never using this menu right here. Now to make this one go away, you just press the top right button again. And here's where it gets really weird. If you press it one more time, then it'll bring up the Performance Quick menu. And here are all the settings you actually want to access easily and quickly. This will include things like the resolution and refresh rate, as well as the performance modes that are available within the software. It's just kind of weird that you have to press this button 3 times to even bring it up in the first place. One other thing of note, they have what they call the frame monitor or performance overlay, and this has most of the information you would want, but mysteriously it doesn't have any TDP information whatsoever. So if you do want to see your power profiles, you're probably going to have to use a third-party app like I am right here. Here I'm using an app called Handheld Companion to bring up these stats, and in the GPU section on the right you can see our TDP. So right now in this game we're playing in what they call the quiet mode, so it's going to max out at about 8 watts altogether. And this is going to be focused more on battery life performance. As you can see, this is not enough to actually play this game at full speed. Instead, we're playing at about 40 frames per second, and we're getting quite a bit of slowdown. This is definitely not something I would consider to be playable. Now, if you hold on to the Lenovo and left bumper button, it'll bring up a menu of hotkey options. And so this is really handy if you want to just navigate through something very quickly, and some of these are pretty helpful. For example, the one I've used the most is when pressing Lenovo and the Y button. This is going to cycle through all your performance modes. So if you press it once, you'll see the auto mode, and this is what they call the balanced performance mode. What you'll see is it'll spike up to about 25 watts, then drop down to 20 watts, and then stabilize at around 15. And I found this to be a sweet spot for most of your lighter GPU-intensive PC games. Here you can see we're getting about 140 frames per second in Hades, and that's really great. Now if we press it one more time, it's going to go into what they call performance mode. This is going to bump up to a 20 watt stabilization. And so this is the setting you'll want to use for more heavyweight games if you want to get a higher frame rate. For example, here within Hades, it's going to stabilize at 144 frames per second. And then finally, we have one other performance mode. This is the manual one. And this will allow you to cycle anywhere between 5 and 30 watts, but you'll have to set that up ahead of time in the settings. Right now I have it set up to the max TDP, so it's going to go all the way up to 30 watts. This is obviously way more than Hades needs, but that's what you can do within those custom settings. So really between these 4 settings modes, I found that I used the balanced and performance mode most of the time. Now I'm still just doing my preliminary testing. I need another week to really finalize it. But one other thing that I did notice worth mentioning is that when plugged in, I did see it bump up about 5 watts in both balanced and performance mode. So for example, in balanced mode, it settled down at about 20 watts instead of 15. And then when using the performance mode, it went up to 25 instead of 20. So to me, this is a pretty good indication. If you want to play this while plugged in, you might get a little bit better performance. That might work out really well when playing it in tabletop mode or when docked. And finally, just 2 other random things I wanted to squeeze into here before we start wrapping up. Like I mentioned before, the plastic feels a little bit smudgy, and even after 2 days of use, you can see my fingerprints right here. So this is a device that you may want to consider getting a skin for, or you'll have to wipe this down from time to time. And finally, the last thing to note, when you have the device turned on and you try to charge it, there is no indication that the battery is done charging. When you first plug it in, the analog sticks will light up, and it'll also flash the battery percentage remaining. But after that, these will both turn off and there's no indication. There's no LED light or anything. And you might think that tapping on the power button will show you the battery percentage real quick, but no, that's actually going to turn the device on. So really the only way you can confirm that your battery is done charging is to unplug it and plug it back in and see if it says 100%. And I do think that is kind of an oversight when it comes to just the user friendliness of the device. And by the way, you can charge this both from the top and the bottom. And also, according to Lenovo, if you use a 65 watt charger, this will charge from 0 to 70% in 30 minutes. And you can get a full 0 to 100% charge in just 80. And that's something that I'll personally test in my final review. Either way, let's go ahead and start wrapping up. This is going on way longer than a first impressions video really should. Now, I don't want to give any final judgments just yet, so we'll do green flags and red flags. And we'll start with the green flags, or the things that are really kind of nice about the device, at least initially. Number one, I think we have an awesome screen. I like how big it is, and I think that the brightness and the colors are really good. It also has a huge refresh rate of 144 Hz. Now, that being said, I don't think it's perfect. For example, I wish it had variable refresh rate, and it's also not a native landscape display. Even though the device is quite heavy, I didn't find it to be too heavy. In fact, it's about as heavy as my Steam Deck when I put my kill switch case on it. I also like that we have a larger battery, especially given the fact that we have a larger and higher resolution display. Another thing I appreciate is that Lenovo is a big business, which means that you can go into stores and actually pick up the Legion Go. For example, I got mine from Best Buy, but you can also get it from Micro Center if you have one available. And this is a big benefit for me in the fact that if you don't like the device, it's pretty easy to make a return. So I do like that added convenience. I also like the fact that Lenovo came up with some innovative ideas for this device. I think chief among them is that FPS mode. Now, it's definitely imperfect, but all the same, I like the fact that they're trying to make things better for the average user. I've also found that there's a pretty active community around the Lenovo Legion Go already. I think there's a lot of people who are excited about this device, and Lenovo is also stepping things up by communicating pretty clearly to their fan base as well. So I do hope that they continue to keep that up. Now, of course, these first impressions were not perfect, so I do have a couple red flags that I need to investigate further. Number one are the ergonomics. I found that this was not quite as comfortable as I was hoping it would be. In particular, I found that the front of the controllers were a little bit too flat and they were digging into the palm of my hands. I also was not a huge fan of the D-pad. I think that it lacks a lot of travel and also has basically no pivot. This will be fine when it comes to playing modern games, for example when you're cycling through a weapon, but if you want to play a D-pad-centric game, particularly when it comes to fighting games, I found it less than ideal. I also didn't like the hollow feeling of the controllers themselves. And they're in a kind of an awkward position. If they tried to make them heavier and more balanced in the hand, it would make the whole device heavier as well. So I understand why they made the decision, but it doesn't help the fact that these do feel quite cheap. Another red flag for me is the FPS mode. I just don't see a future where I'm going to be playing this that often. I'm going to keep trying it for the next week or so and see if things get better, but I just feel like it's a little bit unnatural. And that's a bummer for me because it's one of the things I was looking forward to the most on this device. Part of the reason why it feels so weird is that there's just so many buttons on the back of this device and they don't make a lot of intuitive sense. Not to mention the fact that when playing in handheld mode, you're going to push down these buttons all the time. Thankfully, it's not going to actually do anything, but it still feels kind of awkward. So in the end, that's my impressions of my first 48 hours with the Lenovo Legion Go. I think there's a lot of good things here, especially the fact that we can just pick it up in a local store and then return it if you don't like it. That's a luxury we often don't get with other handheld PCs. Now for the next week or so, I'm going to do a bunch of performance and battery life testing, and I also want to take the time to summarize my feelings about this device and whether or not I think it's going to be a good fit for you and your particular use case. So let me know in the comments down below what other lingering questions you have about this handheld, and I'll try to squeeze them into that review if it makes sense. As it stands, I think this device has a lot of potential, and I think a lot of people are going to be pleased with it. But I'm definitely not ready to say that this is the best thing ever. Anyway, as always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.